I want to start with some context because I think it would be useful for the audience, and we typically don't do this. But the nature of our relationship, and I'm sure you didn't see this at the time because you were on top and I was a very small fish, was that we were competitors. So we both owned restaurants specializing in American cuisine, somewhat centered around the American South, in downtown Los Angeles, at the same time. And you had been doing it obviously much longer than me. Um, and I had always seen you as this prize. And there were so many things I learned before we even met just by watching the way that you did business. Um, but the genesis of this show was rooted in a conversation that we had had, which is crazy. But I wanted to provide that context to the audience because I reached out to you as a stranger. You knew my business partner and executive chef, Sammy Mansour, but we didn't know each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I reached out with a really strange ask, which was, hey, can I ask you really granular questions about how you make money?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was trying to figure it out. The first restaurant I had ever worked in my life was Pru and Proper. I came out of nightlife. I had run bars and nightclubs. And at this stage, we were like a year and a half in, and none of it made sense to me. You agreed to meet with me. We sat down at Redbird, and over the course of a little more than an hour, you let me ask you very specific questions about your business, how you made money, how you diversified revenue, what lead flow looked like, operations, everything. And without hesitation, you answered every question, not in this like broad, high level way, but like in a very granular, tactical way that I could take that information and run with it. As a man that owned a restaurant 5 miles away from you, 4 miles away from you, with,
Last, yeah.
right, in a comparable tier of dining and a comparable cuisine. And that's what inspired the show, right? The fact that if you were willing to be that open and transparent, maybe other people would too. And maybe that would be of interest to a larger audience. But this was all pre-pandemic, Neal. And so now things are more open and people are more sherry, and it really kind of feels like a team at times. But it certainly wasn't that then. So what's your approach to competition? What made you think that it would be okay to do that and it would help me without hurting you?
I don't know if I really think like that. Um, I think I'm an oversharer. Um, Not that I'm supposed to talk about it, but I've been going to an Al-Anon meeting for about a year. I'm now the secretary of my meeting, and I think I've learned how to be a little more concise about what I actually want to share, especially when I'm sharing like with not any sort of response. But to me, I feel like I'm a product of my now ex-wife, who was my business partner for a very long time. I think she had you know didn't always feel well, but she edited me in a lot of ways. I never wanted to be a yelling, screaming chef, and I worked for some of them. Um, and people, like everybody's assumption about me is I like surf and smoke a bunch of weed. Neither of which I really do. I stopped smoking pot in the eighth grade. I've surfed one day in my life, but you know, a lot of people think that I'm very zen about what I do, but it's really just kind of how I want to be treated in return. It's kind of, you know, not necessarily transactional, but like I try to treat people the way I want to be treated, if that's a Buddhist way of being, then that's fine. I think it services me most of the time. I think there's sometimes where, I use the example of, stepping on people's, heads to get them to do stuff. It's like it's hard sometimes to push people, especially now because so much has changed. But um, I've been very fortunate, and my chef at Redbird said to me the other day, he said, Neal, you've never burned a bridge in this business, and he's known me for pretty much the whole career, 30 plus years, and I think that pays back dividends, and I think that I have a lot of respect and admiration for a lot of my peers. Some might be a block away, some might be 1,000 miles away or farther. And I think that to me, like the sense of community that the restaurant has is really what makes me really proud to be in this business, is having friends that are, doing what I'm doing, and treating people right and trying to cook good food and trying to run a successful business and doing it with dignity and respect. And I think that goes a long way. There's a lot of businesses that are not like that, and I think that whenever I'm around chefs, it's like when I do an event, I'm doing an event with Sammy on Saturday night. It's like people ask me, why do I do these events? Especially the ones where I don't make money or I'm paying to be there. Like I'm volunteering my time, my food.
Sure.
Like, why do you do this? I'm like, this is my family. I have a lot of other families too. And I'm, very fortunate to that. And, my younger kid said to me the other day, he said, Neal, you have a lot of friends. And I do, and I feel that's kind of like, I don't want to say a currency, but like, I think that having friendship and community is really what helps you in the good times and the bad times and the middle times. I think it's really important to have people that you take care of and they take care of you and without even thinking about it, and it's like when you reached out and said, hey, you help me out with this, you're like, why would this guy who's my competitor say anything other than like, you should have picked another profession. I think because I care and love what I do. I was mentored by some really great people. And it's funny, my main mentor is this guy, Mark Valiani, who passed away from ALS years ago. And he was Hoser and there's Little Hoser. Little Hoser now runs the Huntington Gardens, and I called him yesterday about an event that one of my chef friends is going to work over there. And I was like, it's so cool that I met a guy, in 1991, I'm still friends with. I can still pick up the phone. He picks up the phone. Hey, Neal, what's up? Like, not like, what have you been doing? Why did you call me? Did you hear about my mom dying 10 years ago? Like, none of that. Just like, let's talk. Present tense. And I think that feels good to me. I don't want to be shamed into like, you didn't call me, you missed my birthday. Like, chefs aren't really like that. It's a different tribe.
You're such a talented chef, and I don't want to take anything away from that, but like when you look at humans in general, like I think that if you are truly excellent in the way that you are excellent in the culinary arts, and you are, I mean, like everyone can just fucking Google you, right? All the awards, all the accolades, all the things. But it's usually to the exclusion of being good at anything else or being
Yeah.
great at anything else. And I started the conversation before we hit record by saying, like, what I find most impressive about you is your business acumen.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you've had such longevity in market, that like your approach, like no bullshit, like your approach to business more than 10 years ago is like the new smart way to run a restaurant today. And like
Yeah.
your strategies just predate in terms of diversification of revenue and B2B strategies, all of this. Like it all came from that conversation sitting on the couch across from you, is where I learned about all of these things and transformed my own businesses
Yeah.
as a result. So on the business side, where did you learn and who have you associated with over time that have made you a better businessman?
I mean, obviously my ex-wife was a huge part of my success. I wouldn't be sitting here. Maybe I'd be sitting somewhere else being more successful. I wouldn't be sitting in my current situation. But when I first started cooking, obviously I worked for Thomas Keller back in the day, which was, informative from the culinary standpoint, but working for, Jopling, Splichal and Wolfgang Puck in their early parts of their careers and really watching them be diversifying. And I think that maybe too much to their detriment to a certain point, maybe not financially, but as, how they're considered as chefs. And, it's the main reason that I personally wanted to be in this space is because we had a venue and a restaurant. And I could walk from 50 feet from one kitchen to another and execute a party for 600 people and walk in the other room and execute a 200 covers for Saturday night dinner. It was no schlepping, which is really the least favorite part of most people with catering, is like the schlep, bringing stuff from one place to another. And Joachim Splichal, before we opened or before we started construction, he toured the space with me and he's like, Neal, build a 50-seat restaurant and make the rest event space. And I was like, I was kind of insulted. Like, he's like, oh, he doesn't think I can run a restaurant. He doesn't think I'm a good chef or a good cook. In hindsight, that's the one moment that really sticks in my head of like, wow, like he was really giving me some earned advice that he learned the hard way, you know. And we now have, we can have 8 or 9 different events on property at one time. And sometimes we do, you know. And, you know, sure, I'd like to be, running Providence and, doing, 75 covers a day, at $350 a head. It's not where I ended out, not just because, we had a restaurant that was, failing during the last recession, and we, basically sold a 90-seat restaurant and opened a, 2,000-seat restaurant. That definitely wasn't our intention originally. But we've organically grown into the space, and, definitely the last couple of years have been really humbling, not that I needed to be humbled any more in this business than I was already. Like with the departure of my partner, and I been working much more with my parent company, and which is Sprout, which owns a bunch of restaurants in LA, including Bestie and Vivel, and formerly Republique and the Rose, and Stephen Schmidt, who's our COO, and I've been spending pretty much not all day Wednesdays, but Wednesdays for between 2 and 5 hours, really drilling into everything. And you know, I want so much more change. Like I want, like I said in a meeting yesterday, I want to go in the office next to me and I want to do these 5 things. And everybody's looking at me like, don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. And but I want to continue to evolve and grow. And and I have a fantastic team. I have so much support. I mean, my main business partner has been supportive in every aspect of my life, and I feel blessed. I wake up. If I don't feel blessed, like right when I wake up in the morning, I do shortly thereafter, and that's always kind of where, you know, where the kind of where whatever the tire hits the road is, that I've been very well supported, and I want, and henceforth I want to support. I want to do all the right things. I want to make sure that I'm showing up as not just fiduciarily, but like culinarily, and mentoring people. And I think all that's important. I think that my business partner and his company that he, one of the companies he runs, definitely feels like that way. And I feel that's definitely something I continue to champion. And it's really what, keeps me, creatively want to doing more. I'm not really interested in opening 50 restaurants. We have plenty big of a restaurant. We want to start doing offsite catering next year. And, hopefully I'm gonna get an opportunity to set up a culinary program in Calabasas at a former juvenile detention center to teach kids who are learning how to fight fires how to also be chefs, which I've been working on for the last year with the County of Los Angeles, and like having it be, maybe the last thing I do culinarily is, setting up a culinary program, and then down the road opening a restaurant in Malibu, and having like, being able to bring people from, one trajectory in their life, which was whatever it might be, not great, doesn't really matter what it is, into something that's a trade. And I really feel there's so many things, there's so many answers, there's so many things in our society now. The trade is not going to be solved by robots or technology. There's still going to have to be those things, and those jobs are becoming not only more important, but higher paying. Being a plumber is probably, you probably make more as a seasoned plumber than you would as somebody who graduated from law school. And then again, you're not being replaced by an algorithm 7 or 9 or 12 months from now, because some AI component figured out how to be a better lawyer than you could possibly be. And I think that that's what cooking is. It's a trade. The reason I became a chef is because I got my high school girlfriend pregnant, and I needed a job. And it just happened to be that I got involved in a job, at a time where it really changed from being a really menial job to being, chefs are very well revered. There's chefs that are billionaires from what they've done, and done a lot of great work. And it's still what I feel is an important part of our society is gathering and breaking bread with people.
I want to pull on that thread about the 50-seat restaurant with the event spaces. In full transparency, I had dined with you many times before we actually met. And on one time, I remember it so vividly. I turned to my business partner and I was like, look at how fucking stupid this is. Like, he's got all of this real estate. All of his PDRs are sitting empty right now. And like, he's gotten more demand for this tiny restaurant than he knows what to do with. I didn't see it. I didn't see the vision, because I was running a restaurant. You were running a business, which was very different. And so, to provide context to the audience, because I think we should layer into this, how many PDRs do you have at Redbird?
We have 5 in the rectory. We have the garden, which would be 6. We have Viviana, which would be broken up into 2 spaces, which would be 7 and 8. And then in theory, we could also break out the lounge and the main dining room. So we would have 10 unique event spaces, all on the 3.5 acre parcel of property, and right by City Hall.
bananas, right? And so you've got this restaurant space with the rectory, and then you've got a full scale, like a full on cathedral, like a real cathedral that's been converted into this gorgeous event space, which in and of itself makes you a category of one.
Yeah.
Um, and so people would look at that and they'd say, oh, he's hemmed into events. What you did was you created optionality for yourself. You were also able to diversify revenue streams because I'm making money at the time at like a 6% margin,
Yeah.
right? Because my business model is people come in, they eat, they get the fuck out. Hopefully they come back at some other point. And I
Yeah.
was in very much in the B2C business. Then I met with you and we talked about it. And you talked about like your business model and all of these different strategies. And the truth is, like, if we were to distill out your business and how you net money, I would
Mhm.
argue, you tell me if I'm wrong, that Redbird exists to promote your capabilities as a chef, to bolster your reputation, which ultimately fosters your events business, which is
Mhm.
the core business model for you.
I think they honestly exist on, different planes, and it's something like that we talk about internally a lot, like how important is it that, Redbird and Chef Neal Fraser are associated with one another. And I think we're all those things, I mean, we're in the process of redoing our lounge, replacing all the furniture, changing the lighting, doing a lounge menu, no reservations, which is, basically a third of our dining room. And definitely our events have continued to grow and our restaurant business has not, and I think that's the ebb and flow of being, we're, in our 10th year, December will be our 11th year of being business and we're not the shiniest toy in downtown Los Angeles. But I still feel like, our service and what we do in the dining room is as good as anybody else in Los Angeles. I think that we spend a lot of time and energy on that. We might not get the accolades for that than some of the restaurants do. And I think we probably get, maybe poo-pooed by the critics because we do events on property and that's not as sexy as just being a standalone restaurant. But like, I got to tell you, every restaurant in LA, if they get an opportunity to do an event, they're fucking chomping at the bit.
My God, yes, for sure.
A couple weeks ago, we had this, conference in downtown LA and I did an event with another chef, you know, shortly thereafter. And I'm like, hey, did you get any of the event we did in down Los Angeles? He goes, yeah, it saved my month. We did 275 people on a Sunday night. We had an event on property and it was, $300,000 in sales, in 3 hours. You can't do that in a 50-seat restaurant unless you're selling, you know, whatever,
No, you can't. You just, you
AK-47s and
can't.
cocaine.
Right. Absolutely. Indeed. Yes. Heroin and cocaine can probably get it done at a better margin. Outside of
Yeah,
that,
but it's, we're still doing what we do, and I think we're doing it at a high level, and our team is very dedicated to that, and I've been really fortunate. Jason, who's our chef at Redbird, and Tobin Shea, who runs our bar program, they've all been here since before we opened. Jason's been one of my best friends for going on 30 years, and people care, and hopefully that it does show. It's like. Right, we were up for a James Beer Award for our bar program, and one of my friends came and sat at the bar, and his name's David Rossoff. And we've been friends for a long time, and he sat at the bar and was talking to Tobin, and then we went to the Beard Awards, and we didn't win, unfortunately. And he goes, "Yeah, I'll come back and sit at the bar when I'm not judging you." And I was like, "Oh, he was at the bar like judging us," and I was like, "That's cool," you know. But I think that you know we care about all aspects. Do we accomplish everything every day? We don't. We definitely have misses just like everybody else, but we learn from our mistakes and hopefully improve them and improve our systems and try to continue to be better than we were the day before. Really not resting on our laurels. We're not pretentious about what we do. We're constantly training our staff. We care. I think that hopefully that's if anything, my legacy would be like, I would say like don't serve bad food and like that we care. That if something's not right, it's off your check. Hopefully that's an opportunity for us to, mistakes are an opportunity for us to win customers. Not that we're going out and trying to fuck stuff up, for the sake of trying to find customers, but it's those times where something goes wrong and we're able to like, oh, these people really care. They served me this. It wasn't to my liking, and they served me that, and I loved it. And they were really hospitable about it. I think that that's a hard thing to learn, and that's a hard thing to feel. And when you do feel it, it feels good.
have you found through a central focus on events that you are in more control of your business. I think
Absolutely.
that, right?
Yeah.
I think the big hurdle for almost everybody is I can't control if somebody comes in on a Wednesday, right? And they don't have control over that. If I'm known for one thing through the media that I create, it's an idea that I stole directly from you, which is I'm not interested in B2C business. I would argue that Pru and Proper was open 6 days a week to promote my private events business, right? The South City Fried Chicken was open 7 days a week, 12 hours a day to promote my catering business because your
Mhm.
strategy works across all tiers of dining.
Mhm.
And it's at a better margin, right? And
Mhm.
it's a lot easier because you can control the inputs that ultimately result in how much event business you want.
Yeah.
And
You know,
so,
the whole
can
thing
you talk
about,
to me about autonomy and
yeah, I
like
mean, the
what
whole thing
that
about
trans-
events is like, a lot of restaurants have gone to like a ticketed kind of, whatever they use talk, or they use, you have to pay, most restaurants don't charge you the face value. They'll charge you $100 and that's enough money for you not to show up. It's just like going to a concert. Like if you don't show up to the concert, Coldplay doesn't care,
right?
they're like, well, you didn't show up. Well, I just, shot a fucking t-shirt rocket into your seat. Events are the same way. If you book a party for 20 people and you show up with five, you pay for 20, and people understand that. If you charge people in the dining room, they get upset, and this is an argument I have with some of my partners. It's just like, I'd rather err on the being hospitable. And it's funny. I was in Big Sky, Montana, with my older kid and my granddaughter maybe a month and a half ago, and we're literally on the end of a dirt road. Not a dirt road, but a paved dirt, right at the bottom, like ski in, ski out, top of the mountain. I walked down the driveway with my granddaughter and my daughter, and I started talking to this guy, and he's like, "Oh," he goes, "You have a restaurant?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Where?" I said, "Downtown LA." He goes, "That's so funny. My daughter, she almost got married in downtown, and then COVID happened, and it was this old church in downtown LA, and I think it's called Viviana." And I was just like, "This is so weird. Like, are there cameras on me?" And he said, "Oh, they canceled the wedding and they getting married somewhere else." He said, "But you and everybody else were so nice. We came back a year later. We had a party, and everybody like had a great time. The photographer, honored their contract. Everybody honored their contracts." And I was like, "That's why you're nice to people. That's the reminder that I have to go to Big Sky, Montana, and run into the guy across the street for him to remind me of why. Don't be an asshole." And it really is about hospitality, and all these things. It's like, we do big gala events. Like, the planner will say, "Hey, will you donate a dinner for 10 to cook in somebody's house as an auction item?" Yes. The answer is always yes. Because it feels good to everybody. It feels good to me. I get to give back to the
Yeah.
charity. It feels good to them. They get to raise whatever, $4,000 to $40,000 on me doing a dinner in somebody's home. And it's like, but that's the energy, and that's the community of this world that we live in. And when it works right, the experiment feels good. You know.
You also, like, as you talk about relationships, right, and the value of these relationships, something else that I learned from you that I espouse and rarely give you the credit that you're due, to be completely honest, is this it's this concept that I talk about called like 1 to 100. When we wanted to book more private events, my central focus was on like, where do I find these events? And you talked about like you go to the people that are already fielding events and you just build those relationships. It's like when I walked away from our meeting, I was like, well, shit, like I shouldn't go find people that are looking to get married. I should make contacts with wedding planners,
Mhm.
right? Because they know everybody that's getting married, and event planners. And you've built those relationships over the years. A great recommendation that you made to me that paid big dividends was the LA Tourism Board,
Mhm.
right? Building that relationship was one of the first things I did. We didn't have a ton of money at the time. I was hesitant to pay for it. I did. And I mean, we probably 100x the
Yeah.
ROI on that investment. So
Yeah.
you also seem like a man that's looking to do business with people that are already doing business with the people you want to do business with,
Yeah.
which is smart, really
Yeah.
smart.
I mean, it's, I always, it's funny. I got asked a reciprocal question, but, what I always say to people is like, it usually doesn't hurt to ask, you know? And sure, it's not always concert tickets. It could be, "Hey, how can you help me run my business better? Hey, how can I?" Sometimes it is, whatever, free stuff or events or whatever that might be. But it's like, usually the worst thing that's going to happen is no. every once in a while, like I definitely raising money for this people, like by asking for money, it felt it made our relationship somehow transactional. Nobody's come back to me and said, "Hey, listen, by the way, when you asked me for money 15 years ago, it felt like shit." But it does happen. It's just like overstaying your welcome when you're sleeping on somebody's couch. It's like, hey, 5 days is good, 6 days is too long. Like, I think that asking goes a long way. And I think, again, like, being the squeaky wheel, like, we've gone through an ebb and flow and bottoming out of downtown Los Angeles. It's, when we first started, when you guys opened, like, everything was happening. They were building apartment buildings around
They
us.
were.
There was a coffee place across the street. The Edison was happening. Like, there was a cafe on the corner. Like everything was buzzing and vibing. And like, you know, downtown is not like that presently, but it has the opportunity to do that again, and it will. And I think that I believe in that. I wish that the city would come tomorrow and say, hey, listen, we're going to a 5-day work week. Because it's going to support the parking lot across the street and the bagel place and all the small businesses in my neighborhood are haven't been able to maintain themselves. And you go a block and a half away into Little Tokyo and it's fucking madhouse. So it's not like it's just block by block. It's not like downtown is dead. Like I would have to say that Little Tokyo is one of those vibrant communities in all of Los Angeles, run by minorities, serving, for some people, food they've never heard of. And people fucking line up and love it. You know? And some of the stuff is okay, some of the stuff is great. It's not like everything is like, a Michelin 3-star experience. It's like some of it's revolving sushi. And that's somebody's first thing. And first time I ever had sushi was in Little Tokyo. I mean, I was like my mom. I went to my mom. I was like, I was probably in the 4th or 5th grade. I'm like, did we go to a different country? Like, where is this place? Like, and that to me is like that's the beauty of downtown LA. There's so many beautiful little pockets of stuff, and there's so many different diverse communities that are like doing cool shit. And it's like that will continue to happen. I mean, the Olympics should be I hope a really good opportunity for us as native Angelenos to show the world like, hey, we want all of you. It's important to us. It's what we are. I think the Los Angeles being the world of immigrants. Saint Fabiana was a patron saint of nobodies. How in 1875 did somebody decide like the martyr of downtown Los Angeles is the patron saint of nobodies? The Catholic Church had been writing like rock and roll albums in the 1870s. It's funny.
Can we talk about Fritzie Coupe for a minute?
Sure.
So, as you know, like I went from nightlife into owning a dive bar in Hollywood into fine dining, which was painful. And then once I had achieved some semblance of mastery with those two things, I decided to jump into fast casual, quick service, fried chicken because I'm dumb, because I'm a masochist. But I did it because I thought, oh, well, these things, they all kind of relate. This is just me building on the next thing. And then always, like all entrepreneurs, like, how hard could this possibly be?
Right.
And then, like every other venture, it was bone crushingly hard. How did opening Fritzie Coupe evolve you as an entrepreneur, as a chef, and actually positively impact your other businesses?
John Moshe is my partner over there. We met riding bicycles. We did a bicycle trip with a company called Velo Asia Travel to Vietnam a long time ago, 18 years ago. And he goes, I'm in advertising. I fucking hate advertising. He goes, I want to open a restaurant. And we're like, okay, let's do a banh mi sandwich place. We ended out on hot dogs. And we opened a place called Fritzie Dog. And Fritzie, like, is his grandfather, his middle name. I can't remember. It doesn't really matter. And, we tried to do, no hormone, no antibiotic, primal cut hot dogs. We made them all with Papa Cantel and Vernon. I thought it was a great hot dog. And some of our hot dogs cost like, $1.50 each to put like before the bun. We were buying Rocco Magner bread and, we're selling these things for $6 or $7 and it just wasn't working really well. And then we got an opportunity to open a restaurant with Said Moses in the Arts District. And we're like, oh, let's do fried chicken instead and do rotisserie chicken and do all things chicken. And then that kind of informed us changing the farmer's market to a fried chicken concept. And, John definitely runs it. I mean, I think I helped with the original kind of like, laying out the space and designing it. And it was actually, surprisingly easy to change from hot dogs to fried chicken. And But again, it comes down to like serving the best product you can for a price point. I think that when there are chefs, the Josh Skeens of the world that like, they do these like, super high end, lowbrow concepts. They're hard, you know. I think that the idea that you can do something simpler and have it be easier is the worst advice you'd ever give anybody. I mean, I don't eat at McDonald's. The last time I was ate at McDonald's was probably 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But we study them at culinary school, and we study Ray Kroc, and we study like they do a physical inventory of all their product, 10 times a day. And, you know, consistency is what drives people back. Obviously location does as well, but like, providing a consistent product for a consistent price, goes a long way. Like I've done a couple events with Anthony Greco, who's one of the pastry chefs at Porto's Bakery, and he told me like what they do in sales, and he was talking about when they R&D a new menu item or when something goes up in cost, and the owner is like whatever, something will go up in cost from like 25 to 35% food cost. And the owner will just be like, just leave it. Like we won't make that margin on that. We'll make the margins on other things. And I think that building a loyal audience, that's what it's about. Some of it is just kind of gut instinct. Like we're spending a bunch of money on redoing our lounge right now. Will that drive butts and seats to our restaurant? I sure hope so. It also, we have, for a lot of people that would think Redbird is like the same as Providence or Melise, like it's super fine dining, and they walk in, they're like, oh, they have a lounge menu. I haven't been at Josiah's lounge menu. I've been talking about it all week. He does something called Off the Glass. I think it's from like 5 to 6:30, no reservations. Our publicist was saying like people line up around the block, and like the prices are really inexpensive, but it also exposes people to Melise or Citrin. It's like there are people that live within a block of our restaurant, and I'm not joking. They don't know we exist,
Right.
just because they drive the other direction. And I think that if you take that as a metaphor for life, like how do you continue to reinvent yourself is by continuing to reinvent yourself. I think that's why people remodel restaurants. That's why people, I mean, the French Laundry has been remodeled 5 times. Their menu hasn't changed in 25 years. That's great. They're updating one aspect of it that seems dated, and the food that doesn't seem dated, they're keeping the same. I think that there's lots of ways to be innovative without changing everything you do. I was watching a YouTube video the other day on, there's this place called, I think it's called Fordlandia, like Henry Ford, you talk about vertical integration. He opened his own rubber plant in Brazil because he wanted to make his own tires. He failed miserably doing it. But this idea of like, entrepreneurs do dumb shit sometimes. It's like I don't need to open a tire plant in Brazil in order to be innovative. I can just kind of look at our own business and figure out how to do it better. It's like the event business, like what we're really concentrating on is like, how do we turn more leads that go cold into warm or hot or booking? How do we market ourselves better so people know what we have? How do we communicate more clearly so our messaging is more clear? I think those are all things that are so important and sometimes get muffled when like we had the being fortunate of being really successful right out of the bag. So there's things we didn't do along the way in order to do those things. And then like obviously COVID happened, and then we were the busiest restaurant in LA for a while because we had 225 seats outside, and then everybody else, they were driving from Woodland Hills to downtown LA to eat at a restaurant. And that ended when traffic came back and reality set back in. And, to us, we have 15 more years left in our lease. And, I'll be 70 years old, and I want to see that, and in order to do that, I have to continue to be smart and continue to not be belligerent and, force ideas down people's throats that don't work. And, listen to what the community wants, and hopefully we can be reactive to that. The event part is definitely, been a huge feather in our caps and a huge success. And it's still something we're continuing to try to get better at, our offerings, all those things.
The other side of that is, and when you talk about the lounge specifically, what I think about, to put it in another frame, is occasion. So, I came off the back of 504, which was 900 usable square feet, generating a couple of $1 million a year. I mean, this thing was like a cash register, right? But I was able to run that off the back of like 3 dozen young regulars that were well connected and intent on drinking every single night. So the total addressable market was small.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at Pru and Proper, at per customer average spend of about $125 to $150, depending on the season. And only 2 types of people went there: the type that could afford it And if they could afford it, they weren't coming back for dinner this month, probably not next month either. And the type that couldn't afford it, and they weren't coming back either. And so what we had to figure out, and we had the first floor bar room, which was a huge pain in the ass, but ultimately a strategic advantage, was we had the opportunity to offer another occasion, which is really what it seems like you're trying to do with
Yeah.
the lounge, is saying, if you engage with us, right, if you like this, you will probably like that without having a redundant experience.
Yeah.
And I think you're influencing behavior. And I think it's a really smart way to do business, as opposed to trying to discount or wheel and deal your way into a second dinner with the
Yeah.
same circumstance. You're just offering them something different as provided by you.
Yeah. I mean, one of the advantages we have is we have a legacy of being a place before the restaurant opened. You know,
Sure.
we were the first Catholic cathedral overseen by the Archdiocese, built in 1876. People went to elementary school here. People got, communion, baptized, got married here, you know. And then we, continue to do a lot of special events. We do a lot of birthdays. We do a lot of weddings. Like people come back for their anniversaries. We have this guy coming in Saturday night. He got married here 9 years ago, and jump behind the line and put a knife in his hand in his tuxedo and carve food with me and you know, creating memories. I think is a big part of what that is. But to us, you always talk about spigots and funnels, in any sort of business, and we're kind of slowly turning on a new spigot, of hopefully people that walk in and say, hey, I can come in, I can order a $14 cocktail and a $15 appetizer and sit in the lounge, which is going to be gorgeous and dark and luxurious, and sit there, and that's my experience. And then I'm like, oh, what's in the room over there with all the light? Oh, that's our main dining room. We have a different menu. Oh, I'd like to tour, Viviana. And then, it's like we become this this mysterious location. And a lot of people do that. I mean, a lot of people, wander into our space and don't realize we have so many private rooms. And when people walk in the dining room and I say we have 3.5 acres of space, a lot of people just look at me and laugh. And then they tour the space. They're like, "Hey, you weren't joking." Like, no, I wasn't joking. We do have a lot of space and a lot of opportunities. And, we're kind of redoing some of our marketing and how we're doing things. Part of that is kind of explaining what we've done so far. And it's like, we've done a whole lot, and, to me, it's just a matter of continuing to remind people of that and re-expose people that, when we opened, they were, 15 years old, they didn't care about Redbird or even, it wasn't Chuck E. Cheese or Shakey's or whatever they were doing. It's like the world has changed a lot in the last 11 years.
I want to talk about your evolution. I think that if we look at the through line through all of this, I think you're a man with an abundance mindset. There's no way that you would have picked up venues this large, right, at this scale without believing that there was enough business, that there was enough grace in the world for you to capitalize on these things. When you look at how you engaged with me, the freedom of information, that's not coming from a scarcity mindset. That's
Mhm.
coming from an abundant mindset. And I think it's really important, but I also think it's really hard to achieve, because the day before I opened my restaurant was full of hope and optimism, right? We all are.
Mhm.
By and large, you are one of the few exceptions. Almost everybody is opening a restaurant at the location of a closed restaurant,
Right,
right? And
right.
yet
Yeah.
we believe that it's going to be different for us. We have all of this optimism. And then you open over time, over budget, like rushed, which is miraculous that it's rushed, and it's always rushed somehow, even though we are 3 months past the date we were supposed to open. And life sets in. And then we're almost always exclusively motivated by fear, right? And
Mhm.
we're not running towards this positive outcome like we were the day before we opened. Now it's
Right.
like trying to mitigate suffering, right? Who is going to yell at me today? Who do I owe money to today?
Mhm.
Right? Like, what compromise or sacrifice am I going to make today? Every time the phone rings, every time an email comes in, every time somebody walks through the door. And yet you seem unfazed, and your career has had wild successes and rough patches, no different than anyone else's. It's not like you've led a charmed life, and that here you are sitting here, you
Yeah.
know, with an abundant mindset. So fucking how, Neal?
I don't really know. I mean, I think I'm an optimist. It's funny. I think a lot about, how I was raised. My mom was an actress when I was a kid. My dad was a musician his whole life. They were really supportive of me. They allowed me to pursue my dreams in the way that made sense to myself. When I, applied to culinary school, shortly thereafter, I had a kid. My parents never really stepped in the way of like what felt logical. They were like, you should stay home. You should get a job close to your kids. So you can support them. They're like, go out and pursue your dreams. Um, and they supported me in that, and, I think that to a certain point, you have to be a little belligerent of what's going on around you. I think, my first restaurant job, I was driving around LA with my girlfriend the other day, kind of like, pointing at stuff and like, hey, that's where Boxer was. That's where BLD was. That's where Grace was. They're all within 3 blocks of each other. And Steve Arroyo, who was my business partner at Boxer, who unfortunately passed away last year. We were almost exactly the same age, and it really like it hurt, like to have that experience. And we were running Boxer together. Like it was a wild ride. I mean, we did everything wrong, and I still woke up the next day and went to the farmers market and bought the best produce. One of my, I don't say unfondest memories is we had this luncheon for this wine group. They were coming in for lunch. It was like 40 guys and all big wigs. And I walked in the restaurant, the gas was turned off. And I was like, Steve, what happened to the gas? He goes, oh, I didn't pay the bill. I was like, what do you mean you didn't pay the bill? He goes, well, we don't have any money. So I'm like, fuck it. I go up on the roof, I take a crescent wrench, I turn the gas on, and we cook lunch, you know? And
I
it's
love
like, what do
it.
you do in those situations? It's like, well, what we had a wood burning grill. We had electricity. Let's cook everything on the grill. And I think that even in our last days, it's funny, like, the last day of Grace Restaurant, we sold Grace Restaurant to move to Redbird, and, the health department came in like our second to last day, and like, we're going to give us a C or something like that. And Jason, who's our chef, he almost got a fist fight with the fucking health department. It's like, who fucking cares if we have a C on our last fucking day? And he's like, those motherfuckers, like, I'm going to fucking murder them. And I was just kind of like, I laughed at it. I was just like, dude, that was like their thing for the week. They got one over on us. Don't let them get it over on us. Don't give them the power. And I think that it's very hard to have a business that's so involved in passion. Like, I could have done something, that took half the amount of time and made twice the amount of money, you know. But I don't know. A lot of the stuff doesn't bother me. I mean, it's like the stuff that, when I talk to people about, like, I have some of my old sous chefs are like, give me like the worst business plan of my life I've ever read. I'm like, where did you get this? Like, ChatGPT didn't even write this shit. It's like, this is terrible. Like, they're just like stressed out. Like, that's as much as they could do with like the stress of thinking like what this whole thing is once you like get handed the keys and sign your name on the dotted line. I don't know, a lot of that stuff I don't think about. It doesn't bother me. It's part of the business. It's like, if you're gonna race cars, you're gonna run into fences. It's just part of, like, you don't go around that corner going 180 miles an hour because you think you're gonna hit the fence. You go around the corner because you think you're gonna win the race. And that's always kind of been my mindset. And also just being able to walk away from it. Like, it took me a long time, like, to miss a service or miss, whatever. Somebody's coming in for dinner. I remember, like, it was a Sunday way back in the day, and I can't remember if my kid was born or not, but Mario Batali came in for dinner, and I was like, fucking Mario Batali's at the restaurant. I was like, I stayed home. I mean, the first time I was like, I'm gonna let the team handle it, and you know, he when they made him dinner, Mario took my whole staff out after and went, drinking, and I was like, it felt good to be not part of that one aspect of my business. And it's a hard thing to learn because it's like, that's why everybody's so burned out and overworked. And it's a lot, it's like, you're like about to clean up and go home, and you put your knives away and you're like, oh, Thomas Keller is sitting at the bar. It's like, fuck, what do you do? Sometimes you just have to, like, allow the things that you built to take care of those things, because if not, you end out with a heart attack, or Steve Arroyo, like, you get cancer at 56 and die, you know. um And that's not, it's not an uncommon thing, suicide and, people self-medicating and, it's a big part of all worlds. I think, it's more seen in the restaurant business. I'm not exactly sure why, but, I think that obviously, it's a different pirate ship, but, there's obviously, mental health issues in all businesses. But, I don't know. I try not to think about that stuff. I've been, really fortunate to, like we have a lot of people in our kitchen that are sober. Not that I am, but it's like, it's not like a race to the bar every night for the whole staff. And, obviously
Right.
those things ended a long time ago. It's like my other favorite story. Jason and I were in New York doing Iron Chef. And it was one of my sous chefs last day. He was with us in New York doing Iron Chef with us, and we won. And the next day, I got this phone call, and it was like, "Hey Neal, I know you're not here, but just so you know, a couple people put pop brownies up for family meal. It didn't tell anybody, and one of the busters went to the hospital in an ambulance, and everybody's high all night, and I was like, motherfuckers, you know."
Oh my God.
I'm like, oh, that's okay. Like, because I was coming back for the next couple of days and I came back and I lined up all the people that did it. And I'm like, you're all fucking fired, you know? And by the way, nobody gets a shift drink for the rest of my career. You just ruined it for everybody, you know? But it's like, you have those moments and you just kind of like, okay, well, I guess that's the way it is. Like, it sucks. Like you go to these restaurants, like, you know, ring a bell for beers for the fucking kitchen. Like yeah, we can't do that anymore, you know?
We
It's
had that
unfortunate.
conversation. I remember like sitting across from you, and I was like, how do you avoid kitchen overtime, like scheduled kitchen overtime? I'll never forget this as long as I live, just because the look on your face when you said it. I was like, we're still scheduling kitchen overtime, and like, we just can't figure out how to avoid it. And he goes, "Wait till you get sued, and you'll figure it out."
Yeah.
um like so matter of factly, and there were several moments like that in the conversation where I could tell like it just came from a place of knowing where like as soon as you must, you do figure it out.
Yeah. It's, it's a, we talked the first 30 minutes about being hospitable. It's nothing less hospitable than firing people and saying I'm taking away a privilege, but it's also, part of longevity is making hard decisions, and I'm terrible with conflict. I hate conflict, I mean, it's like Jason and I talk about this all the time. Like, you hate conflict. I'm like, yeah, I can't fucking, I don't have boundaries because I hate conflict. If I don't have boundaries, there's no conflict. Do whatever I
Right.
want. Walk all over me. Like, it's, but you get older and you start, realizing what's important in life. And, we want to obviously have a place that's hospitable to our customers and our staff. And, sometimes that's a balancing act. It's not always, doesn't always fit perfectly together.
Being a business owner, there's this give and take, this relationship. What I see in our industry by and large, and I only bring this up because you spoke to it, is that, there are a lot of people out there, probably a lot of people listening, that are like white knuckling businesses that just don't serve them, And I can remember you brought up Stephen Schmidt at the beginning of the conversation. And Stephen has a really unique worldview, right? Because he works with some of the best chefs and restaurateurs easily in the country, probably the world.
Hmm.
And he told me in this conversation we were having, he goes, we work with really great people. We open restaurants all the time. We close restaurants all the time. That's the nature of the restaurant industry. Some
Hmm.
restaurants are going to open and they're going to be strong, and those restaurants will eventually close. There's a life cycle to this. And more than anything, it's just important to like know where you are
Yeah.
in the cycle. And the fact that he was able to talk about it without the emotion,
Hmm.
it was smart, Neal. Like it's like that shouldn't be revelatory. And like
Yeah.
that's your approach as well, right? Is that like you've been around.
I think Steven does a little better than me. His perspective is different. He's not, the operator owner of the
Right.
business like I am. Not that he's not my business partner, but I think that he's definitely teaching me how to be less emotionally involved with things. Like if there's a bad decision, like, if you get sued by somebody, well, put it on the little line, underneath, family meal. Don't really think about it as like that guy bamboozled me. Think
Right.
about that. That's cost of doing business, and just move on. You know, I when people talk about restaurants, I like, how are you so successful? I'm as successful as I am for my successes as I am for my failures, you know? And it's like with my business partner leaving, and, it was a huge blow, it was like, but it wasn't working for her, it was time for her to move on. And it took her, probably 10 years to want to quit. And, I hope that whatever she does in the future is great, but it's like, I learned a lot from her. And, it's not like we have a picture of her on the wall that we, talk about every day, but it's definitely like, she'll always be a part of my culinary career, um, and the same with Steve Arroyo, and the same with, Daniel Flores, and the same with Will Cargis, and the same with, the people who are the unnamed people of this world. It's like I've gotten to work with some really amazing people, and I've been mentored by a lot of people, and I've been abused by a lot of people, and I think that, how you take that forward is kind of how you personify what you do in this business. It's very easy to sit around and like, be scorned by all the fucked up things that have happened in your life. Or you can say, hey, well, those are really, I'm so glad that's not happening anymore. Wow, that sucked. Let's do something different, you know? And, I've been listening to a lot of like, like self-helpy, business books, and it's like the one thing that always like stands out to me is like firing early, which is obviously big in tech. If you don't have the right person, get rid of them as quickly as possible. There's somebody said about that in the restaurant business. There's also somebody said about working through those disagreements that could lead to something that's more powerful, because, that person that might have, you know, some bad qualities, might work through them. You might send them to rehab. You might send them to Hoffman. You might send them to somewhere. They come back and they're like more engaged and more involved and a better asset to you and themselves. I definitely, I don't want to say give people too many chances. At a certain point, you have to kind of like, bow out. Some cooks and sous chefs in my life. One, I loved to death. I hired him and rehired him, and he, eventually got deported. But I showed him how to sharpen his first knife. He just, you know, had a substance abuse and anger problem. Like, was still a lovely, wonderful guy who I, worked with a lot and still think about all the time. And so, not everybody's going to be a win, just like, when people pass. It's like my girlfriend says to me, like, or I think it was her grandfather passing, and she's like, I'm almost on to my next adventure. Like, it's just like, every passing of, passing the torch, whether it's, metaphorically or physically or people dying, it's like, it could be this opportunity to, revere what they did and celebrate them, and, in the passion of how you do it. I think that, Mark Valiani was my kind of biggest mentor, and, he taught me a lot and taught me how to be a chef. And like, I used to like, I'll laugh with people. Like if I didn't pick him up and take him to the bar after work, there'd be like 3 hours off my fucking paycheck, no exaggeration, and, we had a roast for him when he died. He had ALS and he died relatively quickly. And we had a roast for him at Dean Fering's restaurant in Dallas. And we all sat around and, just gave him fucking all the shit he'd given us. And then like, went in the other room and cried after. And like, it seemed like he died like the next day. It was maybe a month after, but it's like, that was my guy, and, there's a lot of other guys that taught me just like that are no longer around either. And it's just like, do you sit around like, oh my God, I hope I'm not an addict. I hope I don't get ALS. I hope I'm not a junkie. Or you just like say, those people, who help found me are the ones that I carry with me, up the hill, and they're light. They're very small. They're in a backpack. They're not dragging me down. I'm not dragging a cross up a hill. I'm being inspired by the ones who, took the time, in my career, whether it was early on or, now, and have, inspired me. It's like Drew Nieperant, who's going to be here for LA ChefCon in a couple of weeks. I've been friends with him for 20 years. Like we met in a helicopter. Harrison Ford was flying over a lake, and he was telling us the story of fucking firing David Boulay over headsets. It was me and Ben and Harrison and Drew. And I was like, it's like, and then, fucking David Boulay dies. I'm like, Drew, how does that feel? He goes, oh, we buried the hatchet years ago. And I was like, thank fucking God. It's, but those are the people, it's like knowing people like that and, being able to call them up and say, hey, what would you do in this situation? Or, it's like, it feels good. Feels, that's the community, the support.
I've got one last question for you. What should we steal from you? What are the tactics, the tools, the strategies that have served you well throughout your career that we could internalize?
I think, it's funny. You said white knuckling. I think changing the wording of that, you know, you know, whatever you like, whatever I'll do, like I'll consult and I'll ask for whatever, $1,500 a day. Not that I ask for that much. And they're like, that's a lot of money. It's like, well, I've been, working for the last 35 years in order to be, be able to be paid $1,500 an hour. It's the process is what gets you there. It's like the white knuckling is part of that. It's like I was using this analogy the other day. Or analogy story. I used to race bicycles, and I never got really into mountain biking, but I started riding mountain bikes in the 80s, and I used to ride with this guy named John Tomac, and he was, at a certain point, the world's best mountain biker. And I'd be going 100%, fucking, anaerobic threshold, going up a hill, and he's like, okay, I'll see you guys at the top, and I was like, what do you mean? He was fucking right away from me. Like I wasn't, like I was like, I had like bricks in my backpack, but I continued to do it. Is that a white knuckler? Is it like, if I'm descending and I can't keep up with somebody, or is it just like, is that just part of the process? And I think like, like in kind of talking about, not to talk a lot about Stephen Schmidt, his aspect of things is much more methodical, less based on emotion. And I think that, this business has to be a balance of those two things. I think when you have too much of one, you end up with these chefs that are, we've all met them, fucking super talented, cook really great food. And like, hey, how come you worked in 10 restaurants in 5 years? It's like, well, because I told the, waitress to go fuck themselves. And I told the owner he was a fucking piece of shit. And because he was a piece of shit, it's like, that's not the point. The point is that you have to have that balance. I think that if anything, like, one of my sous chefs came to me one day. She's like, chef, this is so hard. I'm having a hard time being a sous chef. I wish I would have gone to college to get a degree in psychology. It's like, maybe you should, maybe, the idea of, becoming literate and being a chef has to do with more than just being a great cook, putting up great food. It's about the customers you attract, the people you attract around you to work with you, your investors, going into situations that are untenable as far as like, talking about profitability. I would say if you're paying more than 6% rent, like, you better be doing like $10 million a year in a place that's like, the Grove, in order to like make that make sense. 6% is like, it's hard to make money after that. I don't care how good you are. I mean, sure, there's exceptions to the rule, but like, if you follow the basics that I learned at culinary school in 1992, the business model of that, and you put those to work today, you're more likely to be successful than you would be if you're like, dude, my shit is so good that like everybody in the world's going to like it. That happens every once in a while. It's like, fucking Bestia. I mean, I think that P&L, that when they, targeted that restaurant, they're calculating to do $2.5 million a year in sales. And I think at like the height it did 12 or 14. There's exceptions to all the rules of that stuff. And I think that that's amazing. And I think Ori is as talented as anybody else in the world. It doesn't have to do with talent. Lightning in the bottle. It's like, you can't build a business plan and get partners with lightning in the bottle. It's like, there's always the exceptions to all those rules. But, and again, you follow all the rules and you do all the right things, and fucking COVID happens, or, you're in the wrong neighborhood, or, it's funny. Jason and I were talking about like, Dunsmore, which, when that place opened, they were like picketing it, like as gentrifying the neighborhood. And it's like, we're like, Brian Dunsmore is like, so of that community, and like that restaurant has been a huge success, and it continues to be, and it's so well deserved. And the food is great, and the vibe is great, and it's in what I would have considered when they opened one of the fucking weirdest neighborhoods in all Los Angeles, which is like super hot now. They open yoga studios, and it's like, it's not just Dunsmore, it's more. And I think that a lot of that is luck. People say I don't believe in luck. I think that a lot of it is just being lucky. And I think that, but again, you fail, you get back up, try it again. And I think that if you try and you surround yourself with critical thinkers trying to help you make good decisions, you're more than likely to gonna make one for yourself.